Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Northern Expedition. It was a decisive shift in warlord-era China as Chiang Kai-shek spearheaded his campaign to reunify China by invading Hunan. Despite staggering odds and limited resources, predominantly supplied by the Soviets, Chiang Kai-shek relied on the weakness of his adversaries. Initial successes were achieved by exploiting political instability in Hunan, where local warlords were alienated from the populace. Chiang Kai-shek strategically gained support from local commanders, like Tang Shongzhi, bolstering the KMT's forces. The campaign faced logistical challenges such as difficult terrain and cholera outbreaks, but the KMT's superior strategy and local support led to victories along the key river lines. By August of 1926, the KMT had effectively weakened Wu Peifu's forces and secured Hunan, establishing a crucial base for further offensives. However, the KMT's actions had drawn the attention of Sun Chuanfeng, who was now preparing his own offensive. This episode is the Northern Expedition Part 2, the Jiangxi and Fujian campaign. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Yeah, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, I just released a long-form documentary on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. As for podcasts, I'm doing a brand new series on the North Africa campaign during World War II. Also, if you have a chance, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Chiang Kai-shek's gamble into Hunan and then Hubei had paid dividends. Wu Peifu retreated to his stronghold of Wuhan by the end of August. By September, the NRA began a siege of Wuchang, while capturing Hankou and Hanyang. Once Wuchang fell, Wuhan would be secured. Again, for those who might be a bit confused, Wuhan more or less refers to the conglomeration of Wuchang, Hankou, and Hanyang, sometimes called the Three Towns of Wuhan. Wuhan was the first major objective of the Northern Expedition, as it held an incredible arsenal, administrative structures for a government, and other lucrative goodies. Now, from the offset of the Northern Expedition, Chiang Kai-shek and his subordinates chose a divide-and-conquer strategy. The first major warlord on their kill list was Wu Peifu. They chose him because of his power base's proximity to Guangdong, and to be frank, he was one of the weaker big warlords. To the east, of course, was Sun Chuanfeng, who now reigned over 5 provinces and had a 200,000-strong army that had proven itself quite effective against the Fengtian forces. The NRA tried to both avoid Sun Chuanfeng and offer some carrots to him. However, Sun Chuanfeng had no desire to join the KMT because he figured it would see him receive a lesser role than his current position. Yet the strategy of simply leaving Sun Chuanfeng alone had worked thus far like a charm. Sun Chuanfeng did not come rushing to Wu Peifu's aid. Instead, he dragged his feet. It was long enough for the NRA to take 2/3 of Wuhan. Now Wuchang was under siege, and they were quite vulnerable. As reports came in, indicating Sun Chuanfeng was preparing an offensive, Chiang Kai-shek did, I guess what you can think is the unthinkable. Sun Chuanfeng had kept his troops at bay, hoping to reap the benefits of the NRA-Wu Peifu war. As Wuchang became under siege, Sun Chuanfeng finally decided to act, preparing a 2-pronged defensive against the NRA. Sun Chuanfeng transferred 100,000 troops from Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and Anhui to aid the 20,000 troops already stationed in Jiangxi, concentrated along the Nanchun Railway and the border with Hubei. He was going to use these forces to cut off the Wuchang-Changsha Railway, easing the way for him to seize Hunan and Hubei, adding more gems to his Thanos gauntlet. Meanwhile, the rest of the army, mostly Fujian-based, would invade Guangdong Province. Unfortunately for him, he did not expect the unexpected, Chiang Kai-shek preemptively ordered 50,000 men to invade Jiangxi. As Sun Chuanfeng's forces were advancing towards Jiangxi, the NRA bolted into northern Jiangxi, descending into the lowland plain near Poyang Lake. Chiang Kai-shek's men were now threatening the capital of Jiangxi, Nanchang, and further south of the major city of Guangzhou. It took the 1st Division of the 5th NRA Army 3 days to take Guangzhou, while most of southern Jiangxi fell to other NRA forces. Their victories were sped up by the defection of Lai Shuhang, whose Jiangxi 4th Division was one of those Sun Chuanfeng had deployed to defend the province from the NRA. Despite having a larger army, Sun Chuanfeng's forces were by no means unified, and they were failing to work together. The NRA's 6th Army swept through central Jiangxi, smashing the dazed defenders of Nanchang, and then they took the city by September the 19th. This central sweep was done to attract Sun Chuanfeng's fresh troops pouring into northern Jiangxi, who were getting off steamboats along the Yangtze. In the north along the Yangtze, the NRA offensive ground to a halt when Sun Chuanfeng's vanguard engaged them. Sun Chuanfeng's fresh troops hurled the NRA back towards Hubei's border with a fierce 3-day-long counterattack. This prompted Chiang Kai-shek to frantically reinforce them, seeing the Wuchang besiegers become a skeletal crew from the 10th to the 16th. It was not a decisive victory for Sun Chuanfeng, but it certainly was a setback for the NRA, whose position along the Yangtze Valley was vulnerable. Sun Chuanfeng's men steamrolled from Nanking upriver to Kukang in Jiangxi, and then he came up with them personally to direct the reinforcements. He landed on September the 21st, and he set to work ordering his forces to sweep the lowlands. His men recaptured Nanchang after a few days, and most of Jiangxi fell back under his hand. Sun Chuanfeng rounded up hundreds of soldiers, officials, and teachers, suspecting them to be colluding with the KMT, and he had them executed. Many students, both male and female, were being targeted based on their short haircuts. This was a Russian fashion, something of a fad at the time. He had their heads impaled on stakes and put in public places around Nanjing and Kukang to warn those who might collude with the enemy. Sun Chuanfeng presumed the students' teachers were the culprits supporting the KMT movement and made sure to purge any found doing so. The second half of September saw the NRA losing control of the situation. The northern expedition was in danger of falling apart. Sun Chuanfeng's two-pronged offensive was pushing the NRA deep into Hunan and Hubei, while cutting them off from Guangdong. Isolated into those pockets, they would become easy pickings. Sun Chuanfeng also expected support from the battered Wu Peifu, who was stuck in Hubei. Things were certainly not looking good for Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was also facing issues with his base of Guangzhou, as communist and peasantry groups were disrupting his logistical support. Chiang Kai-shek telegraphed the KMT government in Guangzhou to settle the ongoing Canton Hong Kong strike that had erupted as a result of the May 13th incident. Chiang Kai-shek's foreign minister, Yu Jin-chen, frantically began releasing multiple announcements to the media that thousands of ex-strikers were going to be sent to the front lines to support the NRA. With this implicit threat, 16 chaotic months of blockades and strikes against Hong Kong and the British suddenly came to a stop. Back over at the Jiangxi front, the fighting was growing more intense through late September. Several areas the NRA were defending looked quite dire. By the end of the month, NRA intelligence was indicating General Chu Putai's Third Army was being driven out of central Jiangxi into Hunan, and Wang Poling's prestigious 1st Division of the First Army had been badly mauled, and they were fleeing across the mountains. Sun Chuanfeng began trying to coordinate his offensive with Wu Peifu's trapped forces at Wuchang, with the ingenious idea of sailing along Lake Taiyi from the Yangtze dikes to land due east of Wuchang. The landing happened on September the 25th, and initially it sent the NRA 4th Army packing. The entire front began to crumble. Yet Sun Chuanfeng's position was not entirely secure either. His 5 provincial armies were not as unified as the NRA, and his subordinates' loyalties were certainly not trustworthy. In fact, his generals representing separate governments of Jiangsu, Anhui, Jiangxi, Jiang, and Fujian were all clamoring for provincial autonomy. Many of Sun Chuanfeng's administrators urged him to form a real federation providing provincial autonomy. Both Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Chuanfeng were facing different issues, but both could see their authority was crumbling. Sun Chuanfeng began negotiating with Chiang Kai-shek, offering to halt his offensive into Hunan in exchange for a non-aggression pact between the KMT and his 5 provinces. Chiang Kai-shek replied in a telegram that the KMT did not desire to enlarge the war, and that if Sun Chuanfeng withdrew his forces from Jiangxi, the KMT would withdraw from the Jiangxi territories currently being occupied. Sun Chuanfeng then counter-proposed he would halt his offensive at the Hunan border if the NRA withdrew all of their forces from Jiangxi. Sun Chuanfeng was somewhat bluffing Chiang Kai-shek. While his counter-offensive was certainly impressive, he had actually reached his limit in late September. In early October, the NRA began pushing the enemy back. By the 5th, Sun Chuanfeng's thrust towards Wuchang had broken, and his men were rushing back to the steamers to pull back to Jiangxi. On October the 3rd, the NRA severed communications via the railway at Tahan. After that, the NRA reorganized and gradually pressed down into the lowlands towards the port of Kukang and the railway station south of Nanchang. Sun Chuanfeng tossed fierce counterattacks, recapturing parts of the railway, threatening the NRA's 7th Army's flank. On the 7th, a combined NRA attack tried to overwhelm a fortified hill position that dominated the railway line near Yangshi. However, Sun Chuanfeng's inner defensive lines held, and by the day's end, the NRA had taken a severe beating for their efforts as they pulled back. In the south around Nanchang, battle raged back and forth. By mid-October, the capital changed hands multiple times as both sides continued to pour reinforcements into the meat grinder. The annual holiday known as Republic Day, commemorating the Wuchang Uprising on October the 10th, was a morale booster for the NRA forces. Fate would have it that same day, Sun Chuanfeng's relief columns failed to reach Wuchang to aid the desperate defenders. Some of the garrison units secretly negotiated with the KMT, and they opened the gates of the city to them. As the NRA stormed Wuchang, nearly 100 civilians were trampled to death as people fled. Wu Peifu, unable to rally any support, simply bid his time over in Henan. For the later half of October, the combat began to dissipate somewhat, allowing the NRA to reorganize itself. Another major development emerged. Sun Chuanfeng had major problems erupting in Shanghai. In fact, Shanghai was only the most apparent symptom of a problem, for in reality, Zhejiang was falling into a full-blown rebellion. During September and early October, certain units of Sun Chuanfeng's Zhejiang army began telegramming his demands to block entry into the province or the other 4 provinces under his rule, any assistance from the Fengtian forces. A leader emerged, the head of the All-Zhejiang Association, Chuan Chu Gonghui, named Chu Fuchang. Now, Chu Fuchang had numerous connections amongst prominent Zhejiangese, like Chiang Kai-shek, for example. Chu Fuchang began orchestrating a counter-movement just before the NRA began attacking Nanchang. On October the 15th, his association sent a telegram to Sun Chuanfeng demanding Zhejiang fighting forces be returned to their duties within their home province and that Zhejiang be given further autonomy. Then the civil governor of Zhejiang, Xia Cha, began a rebellion supported by the KMT at Guangzhou. Now, historically, Zhejiang had been quite a loyal province during the late Qing dynasty period, a time when many were calling for the end of the Manchu domination. During the warlord era, 3 leading commanders of the Zhejiang forces had conceded suzerainty over Zhejiang territory to powerful warlords outside the province. This caused a situation that saw northern Chinese superiors constantly forced to make conciliations with Zhejiang's independence movements that sprang up nearly every year since 1916. Zhejiang had never successfully shaken off their northern overlords. Zhejiang military leaders such as Xia Cha, Zhou Fengqi, and Chen Yi had defected to the NRA and would become crucial to the KMT conquest of the province. All 3 of these men had gained political influence within the province through their military power, derived from the final decade of the Qing dynasty. Shortly after Yuan Shikai's death, Xiao Chao had led the small Wu Bei clique against its rival Bao Ding clique led by Governor Lu Guangwang. As governor, Lu Guangwang had the upper hand and did all he could to undermine Xiao Chao, who was leading the provincial police at the time. Xiao Chao gradually brushed shoulders with Zhou Fengqi, who worked together to try and overthrow Lu Guangwang. However, the Anhui clique gradually took over the province and appointed Lu Yangxiang as its military governor. Xiao Chao could read the tea leaves at the time, and he backed down. Thus, he backed Lu Yangxiang's rise, maintaining his own power. After Sun Chuanfeng took over the province in 1924, Xia Cha became the vice commander during some of the intense fighting against the Fengtian clique. However, Sun Chuanfeng became wary of the local officials' power, and he began isolating the most powerful, moving them around so they could not network together to overthrow him. Xia Cha was unhappy with how Sun Chuanfeng treated him, and he began rallying the local gentry to demand provincial autonomy and the adoption of a new constitution. Sun Chuanfeng responded by dispatching his subordinate, Liu Xiangqing, to Hangzhou on January the 25th of 1926 to be Zhejiang's new military governor. Liu Xiangqing showed up with his forces and he positioned them at every important route in the province. Thus the attempt to secede was snapped in the bud. Xia Cha put on a smile and he welcomed Liu Xiangqing, tossing a party for him when he arrived to show his submission so he could maintain his own position. Yet in secrecy, Xia Cha began building up police and security forces to start a full-on rebellion, and he had grown quite the private army, nearly 5,000 men strong. Thus at this point, Xia Cha held the position of chief of Zhejiang's police and civil governor over the province. Zhou Fengqi and Chen Yi were both divisional commanders over the 3rd and 1st Divisions, who had received their positions through Xia Cha. After the uniting of the 5 provinces, Sun Chuanfeng had transferred Zhou Fengqi's 1st Division to garrison the capital of Nanking, and Chen Yi's 3rd Division to defend northern Jiangsu. These moves were specifically done to remove 2 of Zhejiang's largest provincial military units from their home areas. Sun Chuanfeng likewise had moved over to his new HQ in Nanking, and this prompted Xia Cha to presume that he would rule over Zhejiang. But of course, that did not happen. The year of 1926 produced good conditions for an uprising to take place in Zhejiang. Poor harvests in 1925 and 1926 led to an economic crisis, which was exacerbated by taxation by Sun Chuanfeng. Then the NRA launched their northern expedition, led by the Zhejiangese Chiang Kai-shek. Once the NRA began their offensive, Xia Cha sent word to the KMT, and he formed a secret agreement with Chiang Kai-shek. As civil governor, Xia Cha promised to officially defect if Wu Cheng fell to the NRA. The KMT likewise notified him that their contact, Liao Yongzhen in Shanghai, would create an uprising to help him against Sun Chuanfeng. Thus, Xia Cha conspired with the KMT to weaken Sun Chuanfeng's rear area, while the bloody battle over Jiangxi was at its height. Xia Cha was going to receive a new title under the KMT, equivalent to military governor. It was to be chairmanship over the Provincial Military Committee. Back over in Guangzhou in early October, the KMT Congress approved this motion. Xia Cha sent word to Zhou Fengqi, asking him to bring his 3rd Brigade back to Zhejiang, but Zhou Fengqi could not risk such a maneuver. Basically, some of his most important units were literally hostages to Sun Chuanfeng's Nanking HQ. Furthermore, if he tried to advance to Zhejiang, he would be moving directly through areas held by other units loyal to Sun Chuanfeng. However, on October the 14th, some of Zhou Fengqi's reserve forces at Nanking did attempt to escape, but they were apprehended and disarmed. Very few made it back to Zhejiang. Over at Xuzhou in northern Jiangsu, Chen Yi and his 1st Division refused Xia Cha's appeal to rebel against Sun Chuanfeng. Without these 2 men in their divisions, Xia Cha was facing a huge gamble with his little rebellion. He hoped the element of surprise would allow him to capture Zhejiang and possibly Shanghai as well. On October the 16th, Xia Cha declared independence for Zhejiang and boarded 2,500 men of his personal army aboard some trains set for Shanghai. It was not long before Sun Chuanfeng received reports via telegrams about what Xia Cha was trying to do. It is alleged Chen Yi may have leaked information about Xia Cha's rebellion to Sun Chuanfeng, hoping to receive a promotion. As Xia Cha's forces of unseasoned armed policemen approached Shanghai, they found the tracks blocked and they were forced to march by foot against prepared defensive positions. The promised communist uprising in Shanghai failed to materialize as local CCP and KMT members were still debating how to go about creating a rebellion in the city. Many CCP members urged action, but they lacked sufficient arms to really do anything. After a very brief fight on the 17th within Shanghai's western suburbs of Zhejiang, Xia Cha was forced to pull out after forces loyal to Sun Chuanfeng led a decisive counterattack. Xia Cha then frantically sent telegrams to Sun Chuanfeng's subordinates claiming he had been deceived into defecting over to the KMT. Xia Cha then pulled his men back to Jiaxing. Meanwhile, at Hangzhou, crowds gathered demanding autonomy for the province. On the 18th, a mass meeting of political activists gathered at Hangzhou, proclaiming independence and support for the KMT government in Guangzhou. Xia Cha publicly joined the KMT, and soon many significant Zhejiang provincial officials joined as well. Xiao Cha then accepted his new title as provincial chairman, and he took command of the new 8th NRA Army. They were roughly 10,000 men strong, completely untrained and very poorly armed. Those loyal to Sun Chuanfeng began fleeing northwards en masse as Xiao Cha went to work appointing new officials. Already forewarned of the insurgency, Sun Chuanfeng transferred loyal troops from Nanking back by rail to the Zhejiang border. By the morning of the 20th, his forces were advancing across the border and wrecking amateurish defenses established by Xiao Chao's men near Jiangxi. Both sides had railway cannons, but Xiao Chao's men proved inept at their use. Xiao Cha fled, leaving behind 6,000 untrained and hopelessly outmatched troops. By the evening, Sun Chuanfeng had effectively crushed the Zhejiang independence movement as he rounded up hundreds of captured Zhejiang rebels, machine gunning them down at night. The streets of Hangzhou were looted by Sun Chuanfeng's men, who carried out a terrible massacre upon the civilian population. Xiao Cha had tried to flee into Zhejiang's hillside in his car, but he was quickly captured in the nearby town. He was promptly shot in the streets, decapitated, and his head was sent over to Nanking, where it was placed on a spike as a warning to others. Almost immediately after, Chen Yi was appointed the new governor of Zhejiang, adding to the claims it was perhaps he who had sold out Xiao Cha. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek had all of his uncommitted troops tossed into the Jiangxi war zone. Included in these were the 4th class of officers recently graduated in October from the Whampoa Academy. It was certainly a baptism under fire for these young recruits. The reinforcements allowed the NRA to finally crack Sun Chuanfeng's growing demoralized forces. Sun Chuanfeng's southern defensive line was the first to begin to sag under an assault by the 2nd and 14th NRA armies. The 14th NRA Army, by the way, was a unit that recently defected from Sun Chuanfeng. By October the 27th, Sun Chuanfeng's forces in southern Jiangxi were in a full retreat, heading north through Nanchang. As the battle carried into November, the NRA began to concentrate along the Shu Valley for an assault against the Kuomintang-Nanchang defensive line. Reinforced by the 4th Army's 10th Division, led by Chen Mingshi, the 7th Army swept down through the lowlands and attacked Tuhan. The enemy's defensive line crumbled, there allowing the NRA to cut the railway line, isolating Sun Chuanfeng south near Poyang Lake. The NRA then captured the ports of Kuomintang and Hukou along the Yangtze, further strangling Nanchang. By the 9th, Nanchang fell, and Sun Chuanfeng's men were in a general retreat heading down the Yangtze Valley. The momentum of the NRA offensive now saw them sweep through Jiangxi. Chiang Kai-shek began sending agents to Sun Chuanfeng again, offering him positions within the KMT. During the Jiangxi campaign, both sides had deployed their best troops into what essentially became a 2-month meat grinder. The casualties would be the highest incurred during the northern expedition. According to some KMT records, the final week's push to capture the Kuomintang-Nanchang Railway cost the NRA about 20,000 casualties, and for Sun Chuanfeng, nearly 40,000. Overall, the campaign saw the NRA suffer 100,000 casualties. The NRA victory saw them acquire an incredible amount of war materials, greatly expanding their military capabilities. At Nanchang alone, the NRA had suffered 4,000 casualties, but took 15,000 prisoners and 20,000 rifles, enough to arm an entire corps. A major reason for the heavy casualties was that the NRA lacked heavy artillery. Early in the summer of 1926, when the northern expedition had kicked off with the invasion of Hunan, the First Army, led by Hou Yingqin, assembled along the border of Guangdong and Fujian. Being one of Sun Chuanfeng's 5 provinces, Fujian posed a threat to the NRA's flank, if he entered the war, of course. Hou Yingqin had concentrated his men at Suatao, primarily to defend the border, but if the opportunity arose, he could very well invade Fujian. In September, once the Jiangxi campaign began, the First Army and Sun Chuanfeng's Fujian allies began engaging in border skirmishes. Sun Chuanfeng had actually already given orders to his main commander in Fujian, Zhou Yingren, to invade Guangdong, but Zhou Yingren had dragged his feet until late September. Zhou Yingren had 4 armies under his command, over 30,000 troops in all. When he finally launched his attack, directed primarily at Suatao, Hou Yingqin had less numbers, but Hou Yingqin had prepared a formidable defensive line over rugged coastal terrain. Zhou Yingren's late offensive was quite characteristic of poor coordination among Sun Chuanfeng's forces, a weakness that the NRA figured out early and they exploited. In another tactical blunder, Sun Chuanfeng's navy, operating off Fujian's coasts and riverways, was ordered to support Zhou Yingren's assaults with a naval bombardment. The navy did so, but did not target Suatao, where the majority of pressure was to be exerted. The main reason for this would turn out that Sun Chuanfeng's main admiral had already begun secretly negotiating with the KMT to defect. In late September, Ho Yingqin's First Army received a major breakthrough. A well-timed defection of 2 brigade commanders under Zhou Yingren provided Ho Yingqin with vital intelligence on his enemy's troop placements and defenses. Ho Yingqin unleashed his offensive, driving a thrust directly into Sun Chuanfeng's southern flank. They were attacking what was known as the coastal road that leads to Shanghai. On October the 9th, in order to distract the Fujian forces already penetrating the border of Guangdong near Songkao, Ho Yingqin had some of his troops cross the Fujian border to capture Yongting. By the 10th, Yongting was seized, as Songkao was likewise taken by October the 13th. Then Ho Yingqin counterattacked the rear of the Fujian forces, threatening their lines of communication. During the rest of October, the First Army infiltrated the lightly defended back country of Fujian. The populations of these parts were mainly Hakka, who had suffered under the rule of Sun Chuanfeng. The Hakka people saw the invading NRA as salvation, because by this point they had established a good reputation for not plundering and molesting peoples wherever they went. Local militias known as Mintuan began assembling to number possibly 10,000 strong, aiding the NRA. The NRA welcomed them warmly into the ranks, forming 3 Fujianese divisions, 1 independent brigade, and 3 regiments. With the additional manpower, the NRA was quickly isolating and defeating Zhou Yingren's forces. One of the last fortified positions was at Tingzhou, and it saw the recently arrived 14th Army working in tandem with the Fujianese allies to take it. As Zhou Yingren pulled back, he lost 500 rifles and machine guns, some cannons, ammunition, and a lot of men, greatly bolstering the NRA. Zhou Yingren and his men found themselves in unfamiliar mountain heights, with their straw footwear quite unsuited to defend themselves against the constant hit-and-run tactics by loyal Mintuan. Along the coast, Zhou Yingren's attempts to attack the ports of Chaoan and Suatao had ground to a halt, and by October the 14th, his men had been pushed back to Changzhou. The NRA pressed its offensive simultaneously along the coastal road and down the interior valleys, making it impossible for Zhou Yingren to coordinate a proper defense of Changzhou. By November the 8th, Changzhou had fallen. Zhou Yingren pulled back further up the coast to Tong'an, where he mounted a defense, but the NRA seized Changzhou, Xianyu, and Yangtai in the meantime. From late September until December, Ho Yingqin had conquered the southern part of Fujian, the most populated parts by far. It was now pressing upon the walled provincial capital of Fuzhou, lying just across the Min River. The defenders of Fuzhou were quite demoralized. Zhou Yingren pleaded with Sun Chuanfeng to dispatch reinforcements from the adjacent Jiangxi, but he was preoccupied with fighting there and quelling the rebellion in Zhejiang. Zhou Yingren had to do best with what he had. Unfortunately for him, many in the Fujianese navy and the maritime forces had not just defected to the NRA, but they added their cannons to shelling Fuzhou from the coast and the Min River bank. Then the commander of the Fuzhou garrison, Li Shongcheng, simply opened the gates to the city to the NRA. Fuzhou was surrendered basically without any real fight on December the 9th. Trapped within the city, the Fujian governor screamed as he was being arrested, "I don't understand what has happened. Our forces and weapons were superior, but you have captured me." With just under 2,000 troops left of his original 60,000, Zhou Yingren limped back to Zhejiang, as Fujian had effectively fallen to the NRA. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I just released a long-format documentary on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. As for podcasts, I am now on episode 3 of a brand new series covering the North African campaign during World War II. This is a very interesting and different series because it's not just me. I have a co-host. If you've ever listened to the podcast The Rest is History, Basically, I'm trying to take a little bit from their format, as I really do like it. And if you'd like to support me personally, you can check out www.patreon.com/pacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to my exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for what I will tackle next. Around every mid-month, I typically put up a poll, and everyone can vote for what the next episode will be, but I do allow anybody who wants to come over and to comment on the poll, any subject they might want to hear about, and if it's something I'm knowledgeable about or I have time to research, I'll do an episode on it. A big thanks to all of you who've already joined up. You guys are awesome. Chiang Kai-shek was utilizing every trick in the book to divide and conquer Sun Chuanfeng's 5-provincial empire. As formidable as Sun Chuanfeng was, he was losing in a battle of wits, and now 2 of his provinces had fallen victim to the NRA. Could the warlord turn things around, or would he be forced to join or lose to the KMT?